well, then, another situation, then one option might be for another person. So we'll go through each one, and some of them are pretty straightforward and some are a little more complicated. But just a couple quick housekeeping items before I get too into depth on that. If you have questions that come up while you're listening to me talk and you're participating on Zoom, you can actually submit the Q&A questions and into the Q&A box, and I'll see those come up. We also are going to be sending out some materials to you to the email you use to sign up. That will be our long-term care planning pyramid. It's basically a handy chart that says here are the concerns and the order of priority of those concerns when you're talking about planning around long-term care expenses. And also keep an eye out with that same email for our feedback form, which gives you a place to let us know if you have any critiques or topics you'd like us to talk about. It's also a place for you to let us know that if you would like us to reach out to you to set aside time for an initial consultation, that you can authorize us to reach out to you through that document as well. Our initial consultations are complimentary. We don't charge for those for people to come in. We can usually give you a good idea of what the cost for planning would be at the end of those meetings, but there is no charge to come in and talk to us initially. So just to get started, I guess, talking about paying for long-term care expenses. What we mean by long-term care expenses, if you're not quite sure what I'm talking about there, is specifically somebody receiving care at home long-term, not just rehabilitative purposes, not necessarily hospice level care, not end-of-life care, but long-term care where they have somebody coming in on a daily or weekly basis to help care for them or do things around the house, right? Or assisted living level care, whether that's memory care or not, depends on the reason someone's going into care. And then skilled nursing level care. So a lot of times people think of it as a nursing home expense primarily, but you may not actually end up, and most people don't end up in a nursing home right away. They often start at assisted living and then maybe transition later on. Some people start at home too. So just to give you an idea of what the costs for these things actually are, because before you actually know how to pay for them, you need to know what it would cost you. And when it comes to the tiers of care, at-home care can both be the cheapest option for somebody, but it can also actually be the most expensive. And you'll generally see somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 an hour, maybe higher. I've heard examples of it being $35 an hour. It completely depends on the person you're paying or the company you're working with. But $30 to $35 an hour for that care. So if you need a few hours of care per week, or maybe only a few hours a day, it might not be the worst. But if you need round the clock care, you're actually looking at incredibly expensive care, more expensive than a skilled nursing facility even. So it can be a good option for some people. It's not always the best option though, especially if you would need that higher level of care later on, or at that time that care is being provided even. Assisted living has probably the biggest range outside of that in terms of what it can cost. I've seen on the lower end about $4,500 a month. That's pretty low. And I've also seen as high as $8,000, $8,500, so $8,000 or $8,500 a month, especially when you get on the memory care side of that care. That's going to be more expensive. So that's pretty expensive on the high end. Skilled nursing facilities you'll generally see in the neighborhood of $9,000, $10,000, sometimes $11,000 or $12,000 a month, depending on the type of care needed or the amount of care needed. Depends on the facility's costs as well, I suppose. But that's not unheard of in our area here in Wisconsin. So nationally, it's going to range quite a bit, but we're by no means the cheapest, but we're also not the most expensive either when it comes to state level care. So that's a lot of money when you're talking about somebody who's in their retirement or later on in life, and they don't have a consistent source of income coming in, maybe other than Social Security, right? So there are a lot of concerns that people have when they go into care or are concerned about going into care when it comes to how do I pay for this? And the first thing, of course, if you're able to, which can be great, is just privately paying, right? Paying out of pocket. If you have enough income where you can cover these expenses, I mean, this sounds like a no-brainer, but it's just something to think about is if you are able to cover your own cost of care, that can be really helpful. I mean, you have all the options open to you in the world if you can privately pay. So if somebody comes in and they're in retirement making $120,000 a year, I mean, they might not really have too many concerns about privately paying for themselves, at least. Privately paying can also take other forms as well, whether it's just through income. You might have plenty of assets to cover your care too. I mean, what you want to look at when you're considering whether you have enough to pay for care long term is you want to take those costs of care and subtract your income from it. And then what is that costing you per month in terms of how much are you actually dipping into your savings or your retirement accounts that you've built up over time? If you run the math on some people, I've had a couple clients who go into care and they end up having a relatively small gap between what their cost of care is and what their income is. And they have plenty of assets so that their money is going to last them longer than they will almost certainly ever live, because we're talking like, somebody in their 80s or 90s living 50 or 60 years is how long their money would last in some situations. So that will be entirely dependent, though, on what your cost of care is, what your income is, and what, how much you actually have built up in assets. So, that is a great option too, even if your income isn't covering it. But you may not have the income required to cover that cost, or even if you are below the cost of care with your income, you may not have the assets required to pay for more than maybe a couple years. It's still important where you can, if you are able to try to privately pay for care for at least a couple of years. So most of these facilities are the assisted living facilities in particular are requiring, we're generally seeing 2 to 3 years of private payment. So what that means is you have to show them or promise to pay them for 2 to 3 years before you access any level of like public assistance through Medicaid. So they won't accept Medicaid within 2 to 3 years if somebody would need it sooner, or they don't have to keep that individual there at that point if they haven't met their private pay obligation. So you still want to at least be able to pay where you can for 2 to 3 years on average, because that'll give you choice in where you go into care. Not all facilities require a private payment, but if you can't make that private payment, your options are going to be much more limited in where you can receive care than if you could privately pay. So if you don't have the income or the assets to do that, the question becomes, well, how do I do that, right? How do I guarantee that I can have that level of payment? If that's a concern for you in particular, or if you just want to, ensure that you have the ability to pay for that regardless of the financial situation you might have, one thing that we always recommend people take a look at is looking into long-term care insurance. And long-term care insurance is, it's not long-term disability insurance. It specifically pays for at-home assisted living or skilled level care. If that's the case, when you're looking into it, the cost can be pretty high. It just depends on your age and your health. But these policies generally these days pay out for a maximum total amount of payment or a maximum period of years or some combination of the two. So these policies, though, can be really helpful, especially where you don't have otherwise have the ability to privately pay, to make sure that, hey, if I go into care, I have these policies or this policy that will kick in and allow me to have more flexibility in paying privately, or have that covered. So we don't sell long-term care insurance, but what we recommend is people look at it or look into it if they haven't already, just because there's a lot of information out there on those policies and whether they're worth it or not. But you have to make that determination for yourself based off of what it would cost you. It is better to look into it sooner rather than later, age-wise, only because the older you are when you start looking into it, the more immediately expensive it's going to be. It is a type of insurance where they actually can still deny coverage if you have certain pre-existing health concerns. So, for example, if somebody came in to apply for long-term care insurance with a company and they said, well, I have just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, it's almost guaranteed that policy is not going to be available to them, because the odds of them needing care are much higher and their cost of care is going to be much higher. So long-term care insurance is an option for people that you just have to look at it and determine with your advisors, the people you work with, is this worth it for you? Does it make sense for you to have? And it's very helpful in just making sure that you can privately pay, at least for the period of time that a facility would require you to. You will almost certainly not find policies that pay out indefinitely anymore. There were policies like that, or there are still some out there like that. If somebody had purchased this policy 20, 30 years ago. If you do have one of those old policies and you're considering letting it lapse because the premiums are getting to be expensive, I would strongly encourage you to really heavily consider whether you want to get rid of that policy or not, because you will never find another policy like that these days. They just don't offer these indefinite payouts anymore. Part of that was because when they created those policies, they completely underestimated how long people were going to live and how expensive care was going to get. So, if you have that in place, they still have to honor that policy, or some company who maybe took up that policy has to honor it, but you will not find it again. So look into long-term care insurance if you don't have it. If you do have it, just keep an eye on it. And if at some point it gets too expensive, the premiums are too expensive for you to just live your life, that's a decision that you'll have to make of whether it's worth keeping it, right? If you can't eat, it's not helpful to have long-term care insurance. So always make sure you are covering your own expenses first, but just because it's expensive doesn't mean it's not worth it for some people. But not everybody qualifies for it. Not everybody can afford it. And some people maybe don't need it at all if they're just able to privately pay entirely. So if you can't afford long-term care insurance, or if you have privately paid and you've run out of funds to privately pay, how do you pay for care at that point? So mistakenly, a lot of people believe that Medicare will cover long-term care expenses. They think, well, this is our health insurance in retirement, so this should cover our cost of care. Medicare will only cover up to 100 days of a rehabilitative stay at a skilled nursing facility. So that's like if somebody had a hip replacement and they needed to go into rehab at a nursing home, Medicare would cover some portion of 100 days worth of care. They don't cover the full amount even, but they will cover up to 100 days of some portion of that care. So it's an option for short-term care needs for some period of time. But after that point, you no longer receive the Medicare assistance in paying for that. So that's when at that point, somebody would start privately paying if they still have funds available. But if they don't have funds available, or they eventually run out of funds after spending privately on their care, that's when they're usually looking to either, Medicaid to help pay for care, or they're looking at the VA's improved pension program if they're a veteran, of a wartime period. And I'll go through kind of each of these programs and how they work and what they're looking at in terms of qualification. So starting with Medicaid, that's the most common one somebody might be looking at if they have run out of other funds, because not everybody's a wartime veteran. Actually, that's a really select few group of people, but it is a good option. So with Medicaid, in order to qualify for Medicaid assistance, when you're looking at long-term care, they look at your income and they also look at the assets that you have, and there are qualifications for both of those. So in order to income qualify for care, your income, the person receiving care, their income has to be, a deficit. They have to be below the cost of care. So if you have more income than your cost of care, Medicaid is not going to help you because you can just privately pay. Once a single person is on Medicaid, they can only keep $45 a month of their income for personal needs. So all of the rest of their income has to supplement Medicaid's expenses, paying the facility. A married couple is going to be a little different depending on whether one or both spouses are needing care at that time. If it's just one spouse who needs care, the spouse who is not in need of care can keep all of the income that's coming to them, regardless of the amount. They do not have to spend it on their spouse's care. If the healthy spouse is below about $3,000 a month in income, they can transition over from the spouse who is receiving care some of their income to get them up to about $3,000 a month. And it's not exactly $3,000, but close enough. So they can transition up to that point. And if between both spouses, they are just below $3,000 a month total, they would keep all of that income. The spouse who's in care, though, other than the amount they're able to transition over, can still only keep $45 a month of their own income. So if both spouses go into care, that's, you're back to $45 a month per person. When it comes to assets, though, for Medicaid, in order to asset-wise qualify for Medicaid, if you're a married couple and one spouse is going into care, you actually get to keep more than you might think in terms of assets. So mistakenly, we get a lot of clients who come in and think, or had been told by somebody along the way, that you have to sell the home if your spouse is going into care in order to pay for their care. And I don't know where that advice is coming from, but it is incorrect, assuming one of those spouses is still living in the home. So if that spouse is still at home and the other spouse is in care, the primary residence is not available for that spouse's care. Doesn't have to be sold. There's no lien being placed on it. If somebody is giving you that information, whether it's, they're probably not doing it intentionally, but it is incorrect. The spouse who's living at home does not have to sell the home. They do not have to have a lien placed on it either. They get to stay in the home, assuming they themselves aren't in need of care. The community spouse, the one living at home, can also keep any qualified retirement accounts. So like IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, anything like that. They can keep any of those accounts that are theirs. So the spouse who's in care, their IRAs or 401ks are not unavailable for care. They are counted towards the total, but they can keep any that they have themselves. So like this can be good or bad, depending on who needs care first and who has more of these assets. If the spouse at home, the healthy spouse, has all of the retirement account assets, that's actually really an ideal situation if that is not the spouse who needed care first, because they get to keep all of that. It's off the table for the other spouse's care. In addition to that, they can have prepaid burial expenses up to about $15,000, not just for each spouse, but even if they wanted to, like to buy those burial policies for their kids. And that's per policy too. The life insurance, they can't have more than $1,500 face value of life insurance. So the face value of that policy doesn't have to do with like cash value necessarily. But the face value of that policy, as long as the total policies that they have together are under $1,500, and again, that's per spouse, so really $1,500 per individual. If you have more than $1,500 in face value for life insurance, they will look at the cash value of that asset or of that life insurance policy as an available asset that you'd have to spend down towards the total that you get to keep. The spouse at home can also keep one vehicle, and that's one vehicle between each spouse. So you do have to use reason on this. It used to be that we could say, yeah, you don't have to keep, you could have a vehicle of any value because there's not really any asset limitation on the value, or they don't put a cap on that. But recently, somebody out there, some person applying for Medicaid, decided to buy an incredibly expensive car as a way to protect some assets, and they did get ruled against on that. So within reason, you can have a vehicle of any value. We're not saying go buy that Rolls Royce out there or anything like that. And then outside of those things that I just mentioned, so any bank accounts, whether they're joint or individual, other real estate outside of the primary residence, the IRAs or retirement accounts of the spouse who's in care, cash value of life insurance, right? That all gets pooled together. They add the values up and say you only get to keep so much of that value. So for the spouse who's at home, they divide that value in half, whatever that value is. And if it is, the value has to fall between $50,000, but not more than roughly $148,000 is what they get to keep. So where you fall in that range depends on how much you have to begin with. So if somebody's already below $50,000, or if their half of those assets would be below $50,000, they still get to keep $50,000. That's the floor of what that spouse at home gets to keep. And that's excluding the home, excluding their IRAs, because those are not counted as assets to that spouse. If there are more than $148,000, if the half is exceeding that amount, they still get capped out at that rate. They're not keeping, if they have let's say $400,000 in assets, they're not keeping 200, they're still keeping 148 at most. If their half falls somewhere between 50,000 and 148, they keep exactly what that half is. So depending on what assets that spouse at home has that are off the table, that could really impact what that spouse has in terms of paying for their own care later on. If they have most of their estate in their retirement account, they might actually be just fine with what they get to keep. If they have the home, right, and that's pretty well protected, they might be okay. But if the spouse who's going into care first has most of the retirement account assets, that can actually be much more detrimental. If you see someone go into care, they have $1 million in their IRA and the spouse at home has $30,000 in their IRA, they're not keeping half of that million, right? They will still most could really only keep $148,000 total between all of the assets that they're shifting over. So you still have to spend down quite a bit for some people. A single person is much more straightforward with what they get to keep on Medicaid. They can keep the home, they don't have to sell it right away. However, there will be a lien placed on it, and eventually Medicaid can recover against that lien. So this is actually where a lot of people are mistakenly thinking that it's the nursing home taking the home. That's not what happens. It's that Medicaid says, in order for us to provide care for you, if you're a single person, even though you may have that home, we can recover against the value of your estate later on after you pass away. They can recover up to the amount of benefits they've paid out. So it's really that nursing home care is expensive and you have to pay privately for it, down to what Medicaid allows you to do or to keep. And if there's anything that is off the table at the time you pass away and, you didn't have to spend through initially, Medicaid can recover against it. So it's more Medicaid taking the value of the home than the nursing home. It's not that the nursing home can force you to sign the home over or anything like that. That's not like an obligation that you have to sign the home over to the nursing home. It's that Medicaid can place a lien on it. A single person can still keep that $1,500 in face value of life insurance, the car, and prepaid burial expenses. And outside of that, though, they can only have $2,000 in assets at most. So that's where it's a huge difference between what a married couple, where one spouse is in care and the other's at home, and what a single person can keep. So Medicaid pays for the care. They pay the facility for that care. The reason that they force you to spend down is because that's what they say, in order to qualify, you're going to have below this amount of assets. So it is income and asset limited. And the reason a lot of these facilities privately or request private payment for a period of 2 to 3 years is because Medicaid's reimbursement rate for that care is not the same as what the actual going rate for care is. It's significantly less. So the facilities can't stay operating if they're only accepting Medicaid right away a lot of times. So that's where that private pay requirement comes in. You're essentially supplementing what if you need Medicaid later on. Now, I did mention also the VA's Improved Pension Program, and that is a program specifically for wartime veterans or the surviving spouses of wartime veterans. And how this works is they actually tried to mirror Medicaid in some ways in terms of the asset limitations, but they did use different rules enough that it's not quite the same. But in order to qualify for this benefit, you obviously have to be a veteran, but you also had to have served during a wartime period, active duty for at least 90 days for other than training, right? So you have to have been active duty for 90 days post-training. Only one of those days of active duty has to fall during a wartime period. So even if you somehow fall like the last or your first day of active duty was the last day of a wartime period, you're still a wartime veteran according to the VA then. You can't have been dishonorably discharged. So, if you were dishonorably discharged, you're not going to qualify for this benefit. There are some exceptions to this now that some of the reasons that people are being dishonorably discharged, maybe wouldn't be the case today, for example. So that's not something that you can appeal that if that's the case. So in order to qualify, though, income and asset-wise for the VA, in addition to those service requirements, the VA has how this program works is it's a pension payment directly to the veteran or the surviving spouse of the wartime veteran. It's not like Medicaid, which pays the facility directly. So in order to qualify income-wise for the VA, your income has to be lower than the max pension benefit that you could receive. So a wartime veteran themselves might receive, $2,600 a month as the max pension, give or take, that they could receive. So if their income is higher than that, if they're making $2,700 a month in income, they will receive nothing. They won't qualify from it. If they have $1,000 a month, they receive the difference between that income and that max pension payment, right? So you can receive the difference between your income and the max pension, but you cannot have income in excess of that pension benefit. Otherwise, you won't qualify. They deduct it from that calculation. And the same goes for the surviving spouse, who doesn't receive quite as much as the wartime veteran. It's usually about $1,500 a month instead. However, what they do when in that calculation is they deduct all unreimbursed medical expenses from your income. So if your cost of care is higher than your income, the VA actually looks at it as if you had no income at all. You had $0 in monthly income because you're deducting more than you have in income. So this pension benefit can actually be a really good tool for a wartime veteran who might be sort of on the cusp of being able to privately pay. If I had $4,000 of income per month and my cost of care was $6,600 a month, well, if I was a wartime veteran, that would actually help me cover my care mostly out of pocket without dipping into assets. So it's not a good fit for everybody, but it can be a good fit in the right situations. And then just like Medicaid, they also have asset limitations on what veterans can have or the surviving spouses can have in order to qualify. And this is where they try to use similar rules to Medicaid, but differ just enough to make it not quite the same. And the VA does not care whether you are married or single. They look at it as the same. And in order to qualify for this, you can't have more than $150,000 in assets this year. There's no calculation for like dividing things in half. It's just they look at what assets you have. The only things that they don't count towards that $150,000 is the primary residence and not more than 2 acres of land immediately surrounding the primary residence. So like this could be a potential issue for somebody who has farmland and it's, hundreds of acres surrounding their primary residence, right? It does depend on what the local zoning laws say you could actually sell. So if you can't sell a lot for less than 10 acres of land, let's say in your local area, if that's not allowed legally, then you can have up to that amount of acreage exempt. But it's heavily dependent on where you live. And so it's not even state laws that we're concerned about. It's local, county laws or municipality laws that we're concerned about then. So there is no exemption for the IRAs of a healthy spouse. There's no exemption for like life insurance face value here. There's no exemption for really anything other than that primary residence and a vehicle. So it is similar to Medicaid in some ways, like with the amounts that they said you could keep, but they don't do any of the same calculations. So both Medicaid and the VA, though, do have what's called a look back period. So many people are familiar with what they think of as the 5-year rule for Medicaid. And what that is if you apply for Medicaid benefits, they look back the previous 5 years and you have to tell them about whether you gave something away, you sold something for less than fair market value, you funded an irrevocable trust to protect assets. If it happened within 5 years of that application, you have to tell them about it. And if you did any of those things, they can give you a penalty based off of how much you gave away. That penalty is how long they won't provide assistance, not pay us back. So the VA recently, about 5 years ago now, instituted a 3-year look back too. So you can't just overnight transfer everything away to get below that 150. That doesn't work anymore. Up to about 2018, it did, late 2018. And so these are some really good options to pay for care. There's a lot of planning that can be done around Medicaid, around the VA, that can help people set aside assets to help supplement care later on as well. I don't have time to get into that today because I'm out of time here, but we will definitely be talking about that going forward in the future. We come back to that topic quite a bit. So if that would interest you, definitely keep an eye out for those webinars as well. And upcoming here, we do not have a webinar next week. The following week, we're actually having our in-person Wills versus Trust public seminar down at the Oshkosh Culver Family Welcome Center through UW Oshkosh. So we do talk a lot about Medicaid planning and qualifications during that. So if you're interested in that, definitely sign up to attend on estateplanninglive.com, or you can call our office. And again, just one last reminder, keep an eye out for the feedback form, which gives you a place to let us know if you'd like to set up an initial consultation. And those are complimentary, and you'll also receive that estate planning, or excuse me, the long-term care planning pyramid as well. With that, I don't see any questions, but I hope everybody has a great 4th of July week, depending on how long you're taking off, I guess. And I look forward to seeing hopefully some of you in person the following week.